The Vatican press room had seen its share of history, papal decrees, solemn announcements, whispered scandals. But never had it witnessed a moment so charged, so perilous, so watched. Beneath the cold glow of 100 camera lenses, beneath the gilded ceiling that had echoed centuries of truth, the world had gathered. LGBTQIA+ activists pressed against the marble railings. Journalists sharpened their questions like daggers. Diplomats, officials, and prelates filled the room with an anxious, bitter air. At the center of it all stood Pope Leo XIV. His presence was not loud. It did not need to be. The man who had walked among the forgotten, who had wept beside mothers of war-torn cities, who had knelt in silence in the catacombs beneath this very city, he now bore the weight of an ancient truth that no modern tide could wash away. Today, he would speak it. But not all eyes were on the pontiff. To his left sat Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, a man many called the conscience of the Church. Known for his gentleness, his bridges built with the world beyond these stone walls, Tagle had long been a voice of compassion toward those who felt cast aside. And the world expected, perhaps even demanded, that he would temper what was about to be said. The speech had not yet begun, and already the fault lines trembled beneath their feet. In the front row, activists whispered to one another, their banners hidden but their intent blazing in their eyes. Reporters exchanged knowing glances, there would be headlines before the hour was done. And through it all, the cameras rolled, broadcasting live to nations far beyond these ancient pillars. For the first time in history, a pope's stance on marriage would be declared before a world that no longer believed in absolutes. When the silence broke, it was with the voice of Leo. Measured. Clear. Uncompromising. Marriage, he began, is a sacrament, a covenant written not by the hands of men, but by the breath of God himself. And as such, it is between a man and a woman. The words, simple in their construction, fell like thunder. The press room erupted. Some gasped. Some scoffed. Others, stone-faced, scribbled furiously. But amid the storm of reactions, one man moved. Cardinal Tagle rose. For a breathless moment, the world held still. And then, with steady voice and trembling heart, he spoke words that no one, least of all Pope Leo, had expected to hear. What followed would shake the foundations of the Vatican, and the faith of millions. But before we enter that moment, before the tide turns, pause. Ask yourself, where do you stand when truth meets applause? Comment where you are watching from. And if your heart still hungers for truth amidst the noise of this world, subscribe to God's message for souls. You will need this journey, more than you know. The world watching that day saw two men, both clothed in scarlet, both anointed to shepherd souls, yet walking two paths that now threaten to diverge before the eyes of the faithful. Pope Leo XIV, born Robert Francis Prevost, had been no stranger to the weight of ancient truths. Raised in a family where the scriptures were spoken of as breath and bread, his boyhood had been shaped by candlelight vigils, long hours in humble chapels, and a hunger for the eternal. In his youth, he had forsaken the comforts of the Western world to serve in the slums of Peru and the war-scarred fields of South Sudan. There, among the broken and forgotten, he had found the marrow of the gospel, not in grand pronouncements, but in quiet acts of sacrificial love. Yet through it all, one truth had remained immovable in his heart, that marriage, ordained by God, was a reflection of divine order, between a man and a woman, as written from the beginning. Across the divide of that opulent hall stood Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, a man who carried compassion like a mantle. His life, too, had been marked by service. In Manila's streets, he had embraced the outcast and spoken healing over those whom the world called lost. His voice had risen in interfaith councils, calling for bridges over chasms of doctrine and prejudice. And in recent years, he had become a beloved figure among LGBTQIA+ advocates, a cardinal who listened when others dismissed, who wept when others condemned. Yet as the cameras turned, as the words of the Pope echoed through that gilded chamber, the weight of his empathy now pressed against the iron of the Church's ancient teaching. The lines he had so carefully straddled were beginning to fray. Around them, the press sat poised like vultures sensing weakness in the fold. Notebooks lay open, pens trembling with anticipation. They had come not merely to witness a statement, but to fan the embers of division into a consuming fire. The significance of this moment could not be overstated. It was the first global pronouncement on marriage by the Church since the sweeping reforms of the latest council. A council that had sought to modernize the Church's voice without abandoning its soul. Yet beneath the polished rhetoric of unity, fractures had grown. Now, under the relentless gaze of the world, those fractures threatened to become chasms. Pope Leo stood with a quiet fire, his gaze steady, his shoulders squared beneath the weight of sacred tradition. His words were not defiant, but neither would they bend. Cardinal Tagle sat visibly torn. His heart beat for the marginalized, for the wounded and weary who looked to him for hope. Yet the mantle of his office bound him still to the teachings that had shaped centuries of faith. The press hungered for division. And with every breathless second that passed, the stage was set for a confrontation that would echo far beyond the marble walls of the Vatican. And you, dear listener, must ask yourself now, in a world that worships the winds of change, will you anchor yourself to truth? Or be swept away? If your heart still seeks what is eternal, subscribe to God's message for souls. And if you will not, tell us below, what part of unchanging truth troubles you most? Now, listen. For the storm is about to break. The first question came clothed in civility, though its blade was plain to see. A veteran reporter from a leading European outlet rose to speak, her voice smooth as silk, her words honed by years of subtle confrontation. Your Holiness, she began, with the world watching, many wonder, will the Church finally recognize that love wears many forms? Will you affirm the unions of those whom society now embraces? For a moment, the question seemed to hang in the air, weightless and yet crushing. Cameras zoomed closer. Pens hovered. Across the room, glances shifted toward Cardinal Tagle, whose face remained impassive, his fingers intertwined upon the table before him. But it was Pope Leo who answered, his voice calm as a river's flow, yet bearing the undercurrent of a deeper current that no eye could see. Love, he said, is sacred. The words fell with a measured cadence. And marriage, he continued, eyes sweeping the room with neither apology nor pride, as Scripture defines it, unchanged through centuries of shifting sands, is a covenant between a man and a woman. A soft rustle passed through the crowd. Some nodded solemnly. Others stiffened, lips tightening, pens pressed hard against paper. Before the reporters could regroup, an activist, young, earnest, trembling slightly with passion, rose from the section reserved for representatives of global LGBTQIA+ advocacy groups. Your Holiness, she called out, voice catching in the charged air, are you not denying love to millions? To say their unions are not marriage, is that not a denial of their dignity? Silence stretched, thin and taut. Even the whir of the cameras seemed to fade. Cardinal Tagle's gaze dropped momentarily to the table, then lifted again, eyes dark with unspoken conflict. Pope Leo's reply came without haste, as though drawn from a well too deep for the surface tempests to trouble. No, he said softly, yet with words that struck as thunder. To uphold the sacred nature of a sacrament is not to deny anyone's worth. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Every human soul bears infinite dignity before God, he continued. Yet the sacrament of marriage was not shaped by culture or by council. It was given by God's own design, and that design is clear. The activist's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came. Around the room, faces hardened or grew weary, the divisions of a watching world mirrored in that single chamber. And through it all, Cardinal Tagle remained silent, his countenance betraying the storm within. Each measured answer from the Pope had drawn unseen lines deeper into the floor beneath them. The civility of the exchange remained, but the ground itself had begun to shift. And so must you now ask yourself, in a time when truth costs dearly, will you stand or yield? If you believe sacred truth must never be silenced, subscribe to God's message for souls. And if you will not, comment below, why does defending the eternal trouble you so? Listen well. For the winds of confrontation have only begun to stir. The tremor beneath the room now swelled toward a quake. No longer content with veiled civility, a young activist rose, eyes ablaze, voice sharpened by grief and fury. "You are fueling hate with this declaration," she cried, words slicing through the air. "Your words will embolden those who reject us, who harm us. How can the Church preach love while withholding its full embrace?" A hush fell once more, deeper than before. Even seasoned reporters sat frozen, pens stilled mid-sentence. Cardinal Tagle shifted in his seat, a breath escaping him, a silent prayer, or perhaps a prelude to speech. Yet it was Pope Leo who rose, his movements deliberate, his gaze unwavering. He did not raise his voice, nor quicken his breath. Instead, he let the silence linger, as though the room itself must learn to listen before it dared speak again. When he spoke, it was with the weight of memory. "I have stood," he began, "in places where labels such as these fade beneath the suffering of the human soul. In the slums of Lima, in the ruins of Aleppo, in shelters where men and women sought refuge from both war and rejection." He paused, eyes resting upon the young activist, not as an adversary, but as a soul before God. "There, I welcomed all," he continued. "Among them were those who carried the wounds of being outcast for who they loved. I did not ask them to leave. I held their hands as they wept. I whispered prayers of healing over hearts that had been broken by cruelty and by the misuse of faith." His voice deepened. "But love," he said, "is not licensed to rewrite what God has ordained. To welcome is not to redefine. The sacrament of marriage is a covenant, a mirror of the divine mystery between Christ and His Church. To alter it is not compassion. It is betrayal." A murmur coursed through the press, low, urgent. Reporters exchanged glances. Cameras pressed closer. And then came the voice the room had waited for. Cardinal Tagle rose. The weight of years seemed to press upon him as he stood, hands clasped before him, gaze heavy with compassion and conflict. "Holy Father," he said, voice clear though shadowed by restraint, "might we consider a broader inclusion in our sacramental understanding? The world cries out for mercy. Is it not within the Church's power to extend that mercy further still?" The murmur broke into open whispers. Division, once veiled, now exposed beneath the relentless gaze of the world. For a heartbeat, even Pope Leo remained still, as though weighing the soul of the moment before heaven itself. Then he spoke. His words were gentle, yet rang with iron beneath the velvet. "Inclusion without truth," he said, eyes meeting Tagle's with a gaze both sorrowful and steadfast, "is deception. And deception is not mercy." The room seemed to exhale in stunned silence. Lines had been drawn. Not in anger, but in resolve. The air within the Vatican press room had grown dense, thick with expectation, with tension wound so tightly it seemed the walls themselves strained beneath it. And then, the sharpest blade was drawn, not from the pen of a reporter, but from the quivering lips of the young activist who had spoken before. She rose again, voice trembling now, not with fear, but with a desperate, aching fervor. "Are you choosing doctrine over love?" Her words struck like a hammer against ancient stone. The chamber seemed to contract, as if holding its breath. Cameras flashed in rapid succession. Reporters leaned forward, senses sharpening for the moment that would crown their headlines. Cardinal Tagle did not remain seated this time. Slowly, deliberately, he stood, his countenance a portrait of anguish wrapped in conviction. "We must evolve," he said, voice steady, resonant, though shadowed by the weight of the hour. "We must evolve in our understanding of love's full embrace. A love that excludes cannot be the love of Christ." A ripple passed through the press, murmurs rising like waves. Some journalists glanced eagerly toward their devices, knowing history was being written before their eyes. Others simply watched, transfixed, as the stage transformed from declaration to confrontation. But amidst the growing storm, Pope Leo did not waver. He rose. Not with haste, nor with visible ire, but with the solemnity of one who bore the mantle of timeless truth. When he spoke, the room seemed to narrow, drawing all ears toward that singular voice. Truth, he said, voice low, resonant, each word carved with purpose, is love. He let the words hang, allowing them to seep into the marrow of those present. To sever the two, he continued, gaze sweeping the room, pausing upon the activist, upon Tagle, upon the sea of watching eyes, is to sever the soul. A hush deeper than any before claimed the room. And then came the image, unbidden, drawn from the well of a life spent among the broken. I have held dying children, the Pope said, his voice softening, shaded with sorrow yet firm as steel. Children who knew love, not as indulgence, but as truth. Who faced eternity with hearts at peace because they were cradled in the arms of a love that does not lie. A single breath seemed to pass through the gathered crowd, one long, collective exhale. And then came the words that would echo far beyond the Vatican's walls. You call it exclusion to uphold the sacred, Pope Leo said, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in unflinching resolve. I call it fidelity to God's word. The room fractured. Cameras clicked furiously. Reporters whispered in fevered tones. The line had been drawn, not in sand, but in stone. The storm had reached its crest. All eyes now rested on Pope Leo XIV, some expectant, some defiant, others weighed down with the ache of silent contemplation. But where the world anticipated counterattack, where the cameras thirsted for spectacle, Pope Leo remained as he had always been, rooted. Unmoved. He did not raise his voice. He needed no force. Truth carried its own weight. When he spoke again, his tone was calm, almost tender, yet forged with clarity that cut through the fog of half-truths and fragile sentiment. Engagement, he said, voice resonant as a bell tolling in a darkened sanctuary, is not endorsement. The words stilled the frantic scribbles of pens, froze fingers above glowing keyboards. Compassion, he continued, gaze sweeping first the activist, then the press, and at last settling, purposefully, upon Cardinal Tagle, does not rewrite the sacrament. He paused there, not in triumph, but in reverence, as one might pause before an altar, lest careless haste profane what is holy. The call of the Church, Pope Leo said, has never been to mirror the culture. It is to reflect Christ. The subtle dig was unmistakable. Not cruel, but a sorrowful reminder that even well-meaning hearts could stray when the longing to appease outweighed the call to stand. Cardinal Tagle's shoulders drew inward, ever so slightly, a man caught between the ache of his compassion and the immutable line of sacred teaching. Yet the Pope pressed no further into the man, only into the moment, into the unseen hearts of those now trembling beneath the weight of the truth laid bare. And then, with piercing grace, he revealed the blind spot that had infected the discourse. Why, he asked, voice soft as a father's lament, does preserving the sacred make some so afraid? Silence swept the room, not the uneasy pause of debate, but a heavy, holy stillness. Reporters lowered their pens. Activists held their breath. Even the cameras seemed reluctant to intrude upon the gravity of that single question. For beneath its simplicity lay a truth too vast, too searching, too dangerous for pride to confront. The Church itself seemed shaken, its fractures exposed, its guardians called once more to choose, culture's fleeting applause, or the timeless echo of heaven. And you, watching now from a distance safe and unseen, must answer that same call. If you see the danger of compromising sacred truth, subscribe now to God's message for souls. But if you will not, then speak plainly. What is it you fear this truth will reveal about you? Do not turn away, for the final moments of this reckoning have yet to be spoken. And the deepest test still lies ahead. The silence lingered, thick, reverent, unbroken. It was no longer the pause of tension, but the breath before a benediction. Pope Leo remained standing. He surveyed the room, not as a sovereign surveying his court, but as a shepherd regarding a fractured flock. His gaze moved past the rows of reporters, the activists with weary eyes, the cardinals draped in crimson, their faces shadowed by contemplation. He seemed to look through the cameras themselves, beyond the marble columns, beyond the centuries of tradition, to the watching millions whose hearts now hung in the balance. And then, with a voice neither weary nor triumphant, but resolute with the weight of mercy, he spoke. "This," he said, his words slow, deliberate, imbued with the cadence of eternal things, "is not about him." His eyes rested momentarily upon Cardinal Tagle. "Nor is it about me." A breath passed through the room, fragile as dawn. "It is about what kind of church, and what kind of world, we choose to build." His voice softened, inviting, not commanding, yet impossible to ignore. "We are not enemies here," he continued. "We are children of the same Father, bound by a dignity that no debate can erase." The tension that had gripped the room began to uncoil, though the divisions remained, etched in the faces of those gathered. "But understand this," the Pope said, and now his tone grew firmer, less a plea, more a charge. "We do not serve a gospel shaped by the winds of culture. We serve a truth that bends for no age, because it was breathed by the one beyond time." He let the words settle, and when he spoke again, it was with a gentleness that carried the weight of sorrow, and of hope. "We need more hearts that listen," he said. "Not more voices that shout." A single tear traced the cheek of one journalist in the front row. Others sat in a stillness rarely known in that chamber. And then came the blessing, offered not to those in agreement alone, but to all. "Whether you agree or not," Pope Leo said, "know this, you are loved." He paused. A beat, a breath that seemed to embrace the very air. "But understand," he continued, voice low with the solemn gravity of truth, "that truth is love's highest form. And now, you who listen from afar, where does your heart stand in this hour? If you are listening with an open heart, subscribe now to God's message for souls. If not, then be honest. Speak plainly in the comments, why does hearing sacred truth unsettle you? For though this chapter nears its close, the call to truth is never silenced. And neither should your soul be. The final words of Pope Leo hung in the air, neither erased by time nor softened by sentiment. The chamber remained still, its occupants caught in that fragile space where debate surrenders to reflection. Cameras no longer clicked. Pens lay idle. Even those who had come hungering for controversy now found themselves grappling with a weight deeper than headlines. And yet beyond those stone walls, across screens and airwaves that reached countless corners of the world, a greater audience now stirred, each heart left to confront the question that no pope, no cardinal, no activist could answer for them. What would you have said in that room? Would you have stood, steadfast beneath the gaze of a world that trades eternal truth for passing applause? Or would you have yielded, wrapped in the comforting folds of trend and approval, yet inwardly adrift? For the hour comes, and indeed is now here, when every voice must choose. And so hear this blessing, not from a throne, but from a heart seeking only what is good, and true, and eternal. May we all seek truth with humble hearts, and never mistake applause for anointing. Now the choice rests with you. Subscribe to God's message for souls, not for stories, but for awakenings. And if you still will not, then speak. Tell us below, what truth here made you uncomfortable today? For the greatest peril is not in being offended by truth, but in refusing to wrestle with it. And the time for wrestling is now.